They thought they were arresting just another black woman on a back road nobody cared about, until the sky itself answered back. The heat sat heavy over Mercer County like a hand that would not lift, pressing down on the gas station roof, the cracked pavement, the faded sheriff's cruiser parked crooked beneath a flickering sign that buzzed like it was tired of telling the truth. Naomi Carter stood beside the pump in a plain dark jacket, travel bag at her feet, her hands visible, her face calm in the harsh wash of late afternoon light. She did not look like someone asking for trouble. She looked like someone trying to keep moving. But in a town like Blackridge, Georgia, movement itself could make the wrong people nervous. Sheriff Wade Collins stepped out of his cruiser with the slow confidence of a man who had never once been forced to question his own authority. His mirrored sunglasses caught the sun, and his boots scraped dust across the concrete as he approached her like the scene had already been decided. Deputy Ryan Becker stayed a few feet behind, one hand resting near his belt, eyes narrowed, posture eager in that dangerous way small men sometimes become when standing next to borrowed power. Naomi had asked for directions. That was all. County line, nearest highway, quickest route east. Simple questions. But the moment the sheriff looked at her, something shifted in the air. His tone hardened. His suspicion arrived before any facts did. "You from around here?" he asked, though it was not really a question. Naomi answered evenly, voice low, controlled, unmistakably educated. "Just passing through." Collins glanced at the bag near her feet, then at the rental sedan parked by the curb, and smiled without warmth. "Funny," he said. "People just passing through usually don't act like they've got somewhere they're not supposed to be." A few locals near the ice machine stopped pretending not to listen. A man in overalls leaned against the wall with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. A teenage cashier stood frozen behind the glass, watching through the window without blinking. Naomi could feel every set of eyes on her, that old familiar weight, the one that came when a room or a road or a whole town decided your skin was explanation enough. Still, she did not argue. She did not flinch. She simply held the sheriff's gaze with the kind of stillness that unsettles people who are used to easy fear. Collins asked for ID. She handed it over. He studied it longer than necessary, like he was waiting for the card itself to confess to something. Becker circled toward the sedan and peered through the window. "Could be stolen," he muttered. "Could be a whole lot of things." Naomi's eyes shifted once, not to the deputy, not to the sheriff, but up toward the open stretch of sky beyond the station awning, blue and wide, and almost too quiet. When Collins told her to step away from the pump, she did. When he said she was being detained until they sorted things out, the people watching drew closer, not enough to help, only enough to witness. Naomi lowered her eyes for half a second, then lifted them again, sharper now, colder somehow. "Sheriff," she said, in a tone so measured it barely sounded like a warning at all. "You need to take a breath and think very carefully about what happens next." Collins gave a dry laugh. Becker reached for her bag. The teenager behind the glass put a hand over her mouth. And somewhere beyond the fields, faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind, came the sound of rotor blades turning through the southern sky. The sound did not belong to Blackridge. It rolled in low and distant at first, a deep mechanical pulse that made the windows of the gas station tremble before anyone fully understood what they were hearing. Sheriff Wade Collins turned toward the horizon with a frown tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if the sky itself had interrupted him. Deputy Ryan Becker narrowed his eyes and stepped away from Naomi's rental sedan, suddenly less certain than he had been 30 seconds earlier. The men by the ice machine straightened. The cashier pushed open the station door just enough to hear better. Even the old flag above the pump island seemed to snap harder in the hot wind, as though the whole afternoon had begun holding its breath. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, shoulders square, expression unreadable, her travel bag still resting on the concrete beside her. She did not smile. She did not look relieved. She only looked upward once, calm and precise, like someone confirming the arrival of something expected. Collins noticed that, and for the first time since stepping out of his cruiser, a crack opened in his certainty. He slipped off his sunglasses and studied her face more carefully. There was no panic there, no pleading, no confusion. That bothered him more than if she had shouted. In his world, people who got stopped on roads like this either talked too much or froze completely. Naomi had done neither. She had answered only what mattered, and every word had landed with the weight of someone used to being heard, even when nobody around her wanted to listen. "What is that?" Becker asked, though everyone already knew it was a helicopter. The real question was why it was coming here. Blackridge was a town of red dirt roads, peeling church signs, and county gossip that traveled faster than the mail. It was not the kind of place where aircraft circled overhead unless there was a wildfire, a storm warning, or a story people would be telling for 20 years. Collins folded Naomi's identification into his palm and took one slow step closer. "You want to explain something to me?" he asked. Naomi met his eyes, and her voice came out steady enough to cut through the growing noise above them. "I tried to." That answer landed harder than he wanted it to. The rotor wash was louder now, close enough to stir loose wrappers along the edge of the lot and send dust skimming over the pavement. A pickup truck on the county road pulled to the shoulder. Two women exiting the convenience store stopped cold with fountain drinks in their hands, staring upward as the shape of the aircraft emerged above the tree line. Black Hawk, matte dark, broad and unmistakable, moving with the kind of authority no local badge could imitate. The sight of it turned the scene strange in an instant. A moment earlier, Naomi had been the outsider, the suspicious one, the woman everybody in town felt free to judge from a safe distance. Now every face in the parking lot carried the same uneasy question. Who exactly had they been watching? Becker looked to Collins for direction, but Collins no longer looked like a man with answers. He looked like a man realizing the rules had shifted without his permission. He glanced again at Naomi's rental car, then at her bag, then back at the helicopter drawing lower over the open field across from the station. "You with them?" he asked, quieter this time. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not arrogant, not afraid, simply done pretending this was a misunderstanding that belonged to him. "Sheriff," she said, "the moment you decided I did not belong here, you stopped asking the right questions." The helicopter descended in a storm of heat and grit beyond the fence line, bending the tall grass flat. The crowd that had gathered on instinct took several steps back. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The world had narrowed to sun, dust, spinning blades, and the sharp, invisible line between local power and something much larger. Collins still had Naomi's identification in his hand, but it no longer looked like evidence. It looked like a mistake. The blades kept turning even after the helicopter settled into the field across from the station, sending waves of hot wind over the fence and across the lot in powerful bursts that rattled the soda signs and pushed red Georgia dust into the air like a curtain. No one moved at first. No one seemed quite sure they were allowed to. Sheriff Wade Collins stood with Naomi Carter's identification still pinched between two fingers, but the posture had changed now. The confidence that had carried him across the gas station lot only minutes earlier had thinned into something tighter, more careful, as if he were suddenly aware that every choice he had made in the last 10 minutes might soon be examined by people who did not care how things were usually done in Blackridge. Deputy Ryan Becker took another step back from Naomi's sedan and lowered his hand from his belt. The crowd near the station wall had gone silent in the purest sense of the word, not the casual silence of boredom, but the kind that comes when a room realizes it has misread the story and has no idea what page it is on anymore. Then the side door of the helicopter slid open. Two men in flight gear stepped out first, scanning the perimeter with efficient, practiced focus. They did not shout. They did not rush. They simply moved with the unmistakable rhythm of people trained to enter uncertainty without becoming part of it. Behind them came a tall black man in a tan-field jacket with command in every inch of his posture. His head was bare, his expression controlled, and though he wore no theatrical display of rank, power seemed to travel ahead of him all the same. He crossed the field with the kind of directness that made people step aside before he ever asked. Naomi watched him approach without surprise. That more than anything unsettled Collins. The sheriff had spent years reading people in traffic stops, family disputes, and roadside questions. He trusted nerves. He trusted hesitation. He trusted the little cracks that appeared when someone was afraid. But Naomi had given him none of that. Now, with a military helicopter sitting in his county and this stranger striding toward them like the road belonged to him, Collins was beginning to understand that calm had not been defiance. It had been certainty. The man stopped just inside the gas station lot and looked first at Naomi, not at Collins, not at the cruiser, not at the crowd. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying cleanly through the fading thrum of the rotor blades. "Are you all right?" Naomi gave a single nod. "I am now, Colonel Reed." The words hit the parking lot like a second landing. Becker's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The cashier at the station window pressed both hands flat against the glass. One of the men by the ice machine took off his cap without realizing he had done it. Colonel Marcus Reed turned then, slow and deliberate, and fixed his eyes on Sheriff Collins. It was not an angry look. That would have been easier. It was the look of a man gathering facts faster than anyone around him could hide them. "Sheriff," he said, "I need her identification returned immediately." Collins swallowed, then extended the card. Reed did not take it himself. Naomi did. She slid it into her jacket pocket with measured calm, then stooped to lift her travel bag. There was something almost devastating in how ordinary the motion was, as if the entire spectacle of flashing lights, suspicion, and public humiliation had not altered her center by an inch. Collins cleared his throat. "Colonel, maybe somebody ought to explain what is going on here." Reed held his gaze for a beat too long. "That," he said, "depends on how honest you want this next conversation to be." And standing there between the sheriff's cruiser and the Black Hawk in the field, with the whole town watching from the edges, Naomi Carter finally looked less like a stranded traveler and more like what she had been all along, someone who had never once needed Blackridge's permission to belong anywhere. The heat did not break, but something else did. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the small, visible ways power begins to slip when it realizes it is no longer the highest thing in the room. Sheriff Wade Collins straightened his shoulders and tried to gather what was left of the authority he had worn so easily just minutes earlier. Yet even that effort felt strained now, like a man buttoning up a coat after the storm has already moved inside. Colonel Marcus Reed stood a few feet away with the patient stillness of someone who did not need to raise his voice to take control. Naomi Carter remained beside him, one hand on the strap of her travel bag, the other resting calmly at her side, her expression composed in a way that made the whole scene feel even more unbalanced. Around them, Blackridge watched from the edges. The cashier had stepped fully outside now. The men near the ice freezer no longer leaned casually or whispered to one another. Even Deputy Ryan Becker, who had spent the last several minutes acting like a man eager to impress, now looked as though he wished the ground would offer him somewhere to disappear. Collins cleared his throat and tried again, this time with a tone dressed up as professionalism. "Colonel Reed, my deputy, and I were conducting a routine stop. This woman was behaving suspiciously near county infrastructure and refused to give clear answers about why she was here." Naomi turned her head just enough to look at him, and that single glance carried more force than any interruption could have. It was not outrage. It was not even surprise. It was the cold recognition of a lie being built in real time by a man who had likely told versions of it for years. Reed did not look at Naomi. He kept his eyes on Collins. "She provided identification," he said. Collins hesitated for half a second. Eventually, Reed tilted his head slightly. "Did she threaten you?" "No." "Did she resist?" "No." "Did she attempt to flee?" Collins shifted his weight. "No, but that is not the point." Reed let the silence sit there just long enough for everyone listening to understand that it was exactly the point. The wind from the helicopter had eased, but the air still felt charged, heavy with the kind of tension that settles over people when truth begins choosing sides. Naomi drew a slow breath and let her gaze drift across the gas station lot, the sheriff's cruiser, the gathering crowd, the road stretching east beyond the station sign. This place had not changed in the last 10 minutes. The broken pavement was still broken. The sun still burned across the hoods of parked trucks. A faded advertisement for boiled peanuts still hung crooked near the door. And yet everything was different, because the illusion that Blackridge could define her had shattered the moment the helicopter touched down. "Sheriff," Naomi said quietly, and this time Collins actually turned toward her as though the title belonged to someone speaking on equal ground. "I asked for directions. You decided I was the problem before I finished the sentence." Collins opened his mouth, but Reed lifted one hand, not abruptly, simply enough to stop the interruption before it formed. "What you decided," Reed said, "may matter less than what you interrupted." Becker looked up at that. So did the cashier. A man by the gas pumps lowered his coffee cup slowly, eyes narrowed. That sentence changed the shape of the afternoon in a way the crowd could feel even if they did not yet understand it. This was no longer just about a bad stop, or a sheriff with poor judgment, or a woman publicly treated like she did not belong. There was something beneath it now, something larger moving under the surface. Collins heard it too. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way he glanced once toward the county road and then back at Reed, calculating, revising, trying to decide whether denial or cooperation would serve him better. "What exactly is she involved in?" he asked. Reed answered without hurry. "At this moment, Sheriff, the better question is what your town is involved in." And for the first time since the afternoon began, nobody in Blackridge was looking at Naomi Carter as though she had wandered into the wrong place. They were all starting to wonder whether she had arrived at exactly the right one. The words settled over the gas station lot like a second shadow, heavier than the heat and harder to shake. What your town is involved in. Nobody said anything after that, at least not right away. In a place like Blackridge, silence had its own language. It was the sound of people revising what they thought they knew. It was the sound of neighbors looking at the same sheriff they had trusted for years and wondering whether trust had simply been habit wearing a friendly face. Naomi Carter stood still beneath the washed-out blue of the late afternoon sky, but inside, every detail around her was already moving into place. The county road, the rusted mailbox near the drainage ditch, the delivery truck parked too long behind the station. The nervous way Deputy Ryan Becker kept glancing not at her, not at Colonel Marcus Reed, but toward the far end of the road, as if expecting someone else to appear. That was the kind of detail most people missed. Naomi never did. Reed took one slow step closer to Sheriff Wade Collins and lowered his voice just enough to force the sheriff to lean in if he wanted to hear. It was a subtle thing, but everyone watching felt it. Control had changed hands, and it had happened without a single raised voice. "You are going to call off every local unit within 5 miles, Reed said. "You are going to keep this road clear. And you are going to stop treating this like a county misunderstanding." Collins frowned, a line forming between his brows. "You still have not told me what this is." Reed looked at him for a long moment, then shifted his attention to Becker. The deputy went rigid under the weight of that glance. "Ms. Carter was passing through this county for a reason," Reed said. "A reason that did not require your cooperation until you made yourselves part of the problem." Naomi watched Becker swallow, watched the flicker of unease sharpen in his face. Some men became louder when they were frightened. Others became quieter. Becker was the quiet kind, which was often more revealing. He had been eager earlier, eager to search her car, eager to treat suspicion like proof. Now his hands would not settle. One kept brushing his radio. The other flexed at his side as if he had forgotten what to do with it. Naomi had seen that before too. Not guilt exactly. Fear of being noticed by the wrong person. The crowd had grown by then. Another pickup had pulled into the lot. A woman in scrubs stood near the air pump with her purse tucked against her side, eyes darting between the helicopter in the field and the sheriff who suddenly looked too small for his badge. The old man with the coffee cup had not taken a sip in 10 minutes. Even the teenage cashier, who had probably never seen anything more dramatic than a power outage during Sunday lunch rush, stood rooted to the concrete like history had chosen this exact patch of red dirt to prove a point. Collins folded his arms, trying to rebuild some shape of command. "If there is a federal operation moving through my jurisdiction, I should have been informed." Naomi turned to him fully then, and when she spoke, her voice carried with a calm that made people listen harder, not less. "Jurisdiction does not mean ownership, Sheriff. And authority does not mean trust." The sentence landed with the clean force of truth spoken without decoration. Collins looked at her as though he wanted to challenge it, but he could not do that without drawing attention to everything that had already happened here in front of witnesses. Reed let the silence stretch, then nodded once toward Naomi's rental sedan. "She was less than 20 minutes from county line when you stopped." "Her," he said. "That delay matters." Another beat passed. Then Naomi added, "Especially if someone in this town knew I was coming." That changed everything. You could feel it, not just in the sheriff, in the lot, in the crowd, in the whole sun-baked stillness of Blackridge. Because a wrongful stop was one thing, bias was one thing, but the possibility that her arrival had been anticipated, that somebody local had been waiting for her before she ever reached the edge of town, turned the afternoon into something darker and far more dangerous. Becker looked down. Collins noticed, and Naomi noticed that he noticed. The road hummed with heat, the helicopter blades slowed across the field, and somewhere behind the station a screen door snapped shut. Blackridge had spent years believing trouble came from outside. Now, under the hard Georgia sun, the town was being forced to consider the possibility that trouble had been living among them all along. For a moment, nobody moved because nobody wanted to be the first person to confirm what everyone was beginning to fear. Sheriff Wade Collins stood in the center of the lot with the afternoon sun burning across his shoulders and the whole town watching him from the edges, but the shape of his power had changed. It no longer looked permanent. It looked borrowed, temporary, fragile. Naomi Carter could see the calculations moving behind his eyes now, quick and restless, searching for an explanation that would preserve his pride without exposing how badly he had misread the woman standing in front of him. Colonel Marcus Reed did not give him that opening. He turned slightly and signaled toward the men who had arrived with him. One of them stepped to the fence line and spoke quietly into a headset. The other began scanning the road, the tree line, the station roof, not like someone expecting chaos, but like someone confirming a pattern already suspected. Naomi knew that rhythm well. First the disruption, then the pause, then the uncovering. In Blackridge, the pause had arrived. Somebody new, she said, her voice even, but clear enough for the crowd to hear. I changed vehicles outside Macon. I altered my route twice. I stopped. Nowhere long enough to leave a trail. And yet I was identified before I crossed county line. Collins looked at her hard. You are making a serious accusation. Naomi did not blink. So was your stop. The words were not loud, but they stripped away what little room he had left to posture. Deputy Ryan Becker shifted again, and this time it was not subtle. His right hand brushed his radio, then fell away too quickly. Colonel Reed noticed it. So did Naomi. Reed turned toward him with the quiet focus of a man who had seen enough nervous officers to know the difference between discomfort and fear. Deputy, he said, have you communicated with anyone outside local dispatch in the last 30 minutes? Becker's face changed before he answered. That was all Naomi needed to see. Not guilt-proven, but guilt-touched. The kind that flashes across a person before training, denial, and instinct rush in to cover it. No, sir, Becker said, but his voice came out thinner than before, stretched tight by something he could not fully hide. Reed did not challenge him right away. He only nodded once, as if filing the answer where it belonged. Then he looked toward the sheriff. I asked you to clear local traffic, he said. That order still stands. Collins hesitated, and in that hesitation the whole county seemed to tilt. Blackridge had probably never seen him unsure in public. Men like Wade Collins built their reputations on never appearing cornered, especially not in front of the very people whose loyalty kept them strong. But loyalty was changing shape too. Naomi could feel it in the crowd. The woman in scrubs no longer looked at Naomi like she was a problem. The old man with the coffee cup was watching Becker now. The cashier had stepped closer to the pumps, curiosity overtaking caution. Truth has a way of moving through a small town faster than patrol lights ever can. Collins finally lifted his radio. His voice remained steady, but only because he forced it to. He instructed nearby units to hold position and stay off the county road until further notice. No one in the lot spoke while he did it. Even the cicadas in the weeds seemed to hush for a second, as if the land itself was listening. When he lowered the radio, Reed stepped closer. Good, he said. Now here is what happens next. My team secures this perimeter. Ms. Carter continues her movement once we verify the breach. And if that breach came from inside your office, Sheriff, then the delay today is going to matter to more people than you. Collins stared at him. Breach. Reed looked briefly toward Naomi, giving her the choice. She took it. There is a transfer route running through this county, she said. Not for cargo. For information. Courier drops, debt exchanges, local facilitators. Somebody embedded in this town has been protecting it. The lot went still again, but this time the silence was not confusion. It was recognition. Not because everyone understood the details, but because every small town knows the feeling of a secret that has been hiding in plain sight. Becker looked pale now beneath the sun. Collins heard the shift in the air around his own deputy, and Naomi saw something pass across the sheriff's face then, brief but unmistakable. It was not just fear of federal scrutiny. It was the dawning possibility that the rot he thought he controlled might have been standing right beside him all along. The realization did not arrive like thunder. It moved more quietly than that, spreading across the lot in the looks people gave one another, in the way Sheriff Wade Collins no longer stood quite as tall, in the way Deputy Ryan Becker seemed unable to find a place for his eyes to rest. Naomi Carter had seen this moment before in other towns, other offices, other rooms where men had mistaken familiarity for control. The first crack never came from force. It came from recognition, from the sudden understanding that the person they tried to diminish had walked in carrying more truth than the whole system around them could survive. Colonel Marcus Reed let the silence do its work for several seconds before he finally spoke again. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone formal now, deliberate enough for every witness in the lot to hear. "You are cleared to brief." That single sentence shifted the entire scene, not because it was loud, but because it named what Sheriff Collins had failed to see from the beginning. Naomi was not simply attached to something important. She was central to it. She set her travel bag on the hood of the rental sedan and unzipped the outer compartment with the calm precision of someone who had performed difficult work under worse pressure than this. When she reached inside, every eye followed the motion. She withdrew a slim leather case and opened it without drama. Inside was an identification wallet and a folded document packet sealed with a federal crest. She showed the identification first to Colonel Reed, then angled it toward Sheriff Collins just long enough for him to read it clearly. Naomi Carter, Federal Strategic Liaison, Special Operations Task Group, Temporary Field Authority under Joint Command Authorization. Collins stared at the credentials as if the words might rearrange themselves into something easier to live with. They did not. The woman he had stopped for asking directions was not a drifter, not a trespasser, not some nameless outsider he could control with suspicion and a badge. She was a federal operations lead moving through his county on mission authority broad enough to outrank every assumption he had made about her. Becker looked away first. Collins did not. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps some part of him still believed that if he held eye contact long enough, the humiliation would not be visible to the people of Blackridge gathering around the pumps and station wall. But it was visible. It was in the cashier's parted lips, in the quiet gasp from the woman in scrubs, in the old man slowly lowering his coffee cup as though even his hands understood the weight of what had just been revealed. Reed accepted the document packet and handed it back unopened. "Proceed," he said. Naomi closed the case and looked directly at the sheriff. "I was moving through this county under sealed routing because a courier network has been feeding protected information through rural jurisdictions that people assume nobody watches. The route changed 3 times in 48 hours. Access was compartmentalized. Yet before I reached the county line, I was flagged, delayed, and publicly identified by local officers with no operational need to know I existed." Collins swallowed hard. Naomi continued, her voice steady, but colder now, stripped of even the courtesy she had shown when she first asked for directions. "That means one of two things. Either your office has been observed by people outside your control, or someone close to your office has been feeding movement data to the wrong hands." Nobody in the lot moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The Georgia sun still burned above them, and yet a chill passed through the scene all the same. Reed stepped beside Naomi, not to overshadow her, but to confirm what the town was already beginning to understand. "Ms. Carter is not support personnel," he said. "She is the principal field lead on this operation." That was the final turn of the knife, though no blade was needed. The crowd understood it now. Sheriff Collins understood it now. Even Becker understood it, standing there pale and rigid, realizing that the woman he had treated like she did not belong had been the most important person to touch Blackridge in years. Naomi slipped the identification case back into her bag and lifted her eyes toward the sheriff one last time. There was no triumph in her face, only the hard dignity of someone who had been underestimated too many times to waste energy enjoying it. "You stopped the wrong woman," she said. "But that is not the worst part. The worst part is that your town may have been waiting for me before I ever got here." The words hung there with nowhere to go, too sharp to ignore and too precise to be dismissed as misunderstanding. In the distance, the helicopter blades had slowed to a heavy idle, but the real pressure now was not coming from the field across the road. It was coming from the truth standing in the middle of Blackridge, plain as sunlight, impossible to put back once seen. Sheriff Wade Collins said nothing at first. He could not. The silence around him had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of a town waiting for its sheriff to speak. It was the silence of people beginning to wonder whether they had trusted the wrong man for too long. Naomi Carter could feel that shift in every face turned toward the lot, in every held breath, in every careful glance now landing not on her, but on Deputy Ryan Becker. He was still standing near the rear quarter panel of her rental sedan, but whatever confidence had been there earlier was gone. His shoulders had drawn in. His jaw was clenched too tightly. Sweat glistened at his temples, and not just from the Georgia heat. Colonel Marcus Reed followed the same line of sight Naomi had already traced. Then, without hurry, he spoke to one of the men from his team. "Secure local communications access," he said. "And I want dispatch logs from county, municipal, and highway relay for the last 90 minutes. The man nodded once and moved toward the helicopter crew vehicle with efficient purpose. Reed then turned back to Collins. "Your radios stay live, Sheriff, but every outgoing record from this point forward is preserved." Collins lifted his chin, trying to recover something of himself. "You are treating my department like suspects." Reed did not blink. "I am treating your department like a point of failure." That landed harder than accusation because it did not sound emotional. It sounded official. Final. Becker looked toward the road again, and this time Naomi saw it clearly. Not fear of Reed. Not fear of federal oversight. Fear that someone else might already know the operation had shifted. Fear that the delay at the gas station had not merely slowed her route, but triggered consequences he could not control. "Deputy," Naomi said quietly, and the fact that he flinched at her voice did more damage than any denial could repair. "Who were you expecting to call?" Becker opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Collins turned toward him with a look that was no longer protective. It was searching now, hard and uncertain, the look of a man suddenly forced to consider whether the weakness in his office had been standing beside him in uniform. "Answer her," Collins said. Becker swallowed. "I did not call anybody." Naomi held his gaze. "You did not need to. Someone only had to know enough to watch County Line and trust that local bias would do the rest." A murmur moved through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable. In small towns, people know the sound of a story turning. They know when an afternoon stops being gossip and starts becoming history. The woman in scrubs stepped back as if distance might protect her from what she was hearing. The cashier folded her arms over her chest, eyes wide, no longer curious now, but unsettled in a deeper way. This was not just about a mistaken stop anymore. It was about the possibility that Blackridge, with its old habits and easy suspicions, had become useful to something hidden and dangerous precisely because nobody thought to question it. Reed stepped closer to Becker, not threatening, simply unmovable. "Hand me your radio," he said. Becker hesitated. That was enough. Reed extended his hand and waited, and under the weight of every eye in the lot, Becker finally unclipped the radio and placed it in the colonel's palm. Reed passed it to one of his men without looking away. "Badge as well." Collins stiffened. "Colonel, that is still my deputy." Reed answered without turning. "Then you should ask yourself why he seems more afraid of what is coming down that road than of what has happened here." No one spoke after that because everyone had heard it too. Far off, beyond the low tree line and heat shimmer of the county road, there was the faint growl of an engine approaching too fast for a place like this. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the sound, her expression tightening for the first time all afternoon. Whatever had been set in motion before she reached Blackridge was no longer hidden. It was moving. The engine noise grew louder by the second, tearing down the county road with the kind of urgency that did not belong to ordinary traffic. Everyone in the lot turned toward it at once. Dust lifted in the distance. A dark sport utility vehicle came into view too fast, then braked hard near the shoulder just beyond the gas station entrance. For one suspended heartbeat, nobody moved. Naomi Carter's eyes narrowed, not with fear, but with recognition. Colonel Marcus Reed signaled with one hand, and his team shifted positions with immediate precision, creating order without chaos, presence without spectacle. Sheriff Wade Collins stood frozen beside his cruiser, caught between instinct and uncertainty, while Deputy Ryan Becker looked as though every bad decision he had ever made had suddenly found its way back to him. The driver's door of the vehicle opened. A man stepped out in plain clothes, late 40s, clean boots, pressed shirt, county face, the kind of man who could walk into a feed store or a church fellowship hall and never draw a second glance. That, Naomi knew, was exactly the point. Hidden systems rarely announced themselves with dramatic faces. They survived by looking familiar. The man stopped when he saw the helicopter in the field, the federal team in the lot, and Becker standing without his radio. His expression changed, just slightly, but enough. Reed saw it too. "Do not come any closer," Reed said, his voice calm and absolute. The man lifted both hands halfway, not in surrender, but in performance. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said. It was the kind of sentence people used when they had spent years believing words alone could still steer the room. Naomi stepped forward before Collins could say anything. "No," she said, her voice low and steady. "The misunderstanding happened when people here assumed I was alone." The man looked at her then, and in that look the whole truth surfaced. He knew exactly who she was. Maybe not by name at first. Maybe not until the route shifted. But he knew she mattered. He knew enough to come himself when the stop took longer than expected. Collins turned slowly toward Becker, then toward the stranger, and something inside him seemed to give way at last. The sheriff had not built the larger machine, but he had fed it with laziness, pride, and the easy cruelty of a man too used to being obeyed. He had helped create the kind of town where the wrong woman could be delayed simply because she was black and alone on the wrong road, and that had made his county useful to people far worse than he understood. Reed's men moved in and secured the scene with crisp efficiency. Nobody shouted. Nobody had to. The stranger was escorted aside. Becker's communications were logged, and Sheriff Collins was instructed to surrender access to all active local coordination until federal review could be completed. The crowd watched in total silence, the kind that only comes when a community realizes it is seeing the end of one story and the beginning of another. Naomi stood near the hood of her rental sedan with the Georgia sun warming one side of her face and the Black Hawk waiting across the road like a promise the sky had kept. She looked at Collins once more, and this time he could not hold her gaze. The badge on his chest no longer seemed to shine. It just looked heavy. "I asked you for directions," Naomi said. "You answered with suspicion. And because you did, the truth had to land here where everyone could see it." Collins lowered his head, not in ceremony, not in dignity, but in the quiet shock of a man meeting the full weight of his own choices. Naomi picked up her bag, and Reed walked with her toward the field. Behind them, Blackridge remained still, every witness marked by what they had seen. A town that once believed power lived in a cruiser, a badge, and a familiar last name had learned something larger that day. Power is not what humiliates the vulnerable and calls it order. Power is what arrives with the truth, stands in the heat, and leaves no room for lies to hide. And as Naomi Carter stepped toward the waiting helicopter without looking back, the lesson settled over Blackridge like a final verdict. He thought the road belonged to him, but the sky answered to a higher law.